This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a series for critical animal studies scholarship from a range of different disciplinary perspectives. Recent episodes of Knowing Animals have featured the feminist theorist Chloe Taylor, one of the editors of the Animal Politics series, and the critical animal studies scholar Richard Twine, whose book The Climate Crisis and Other Animals is a recent entry in the Animal Politics list. I encourage you all to go back and listen to these episodes if you haven't already. Now, I first met today's guest in Canterbury at the 2023 conference of the Society for the Psychology of Human-Animal Intergroup Relations, or FAIR, that's PHAIR, and she recently hosted the 2025 FAIR conference in Edinburgh. Dr. Matti Wilks is a social and developmental psychologist who is a reader in psychology at the University of Edinburgh. Her work explores people's moral motivation and actions. And this includes lots of work that will be of interest to listeners, including research addressing the psychology of moral concern for animals, one of the things we're going to be talking about today, and research addressing attitudes towards cultivated meat. Today, we're going to talk about her 2025 paper, When Development Constricts Our Moral Circle, which was co-authored with Julia Marshall, Lucius Caviola, and Karri Neldner, and published in Nature Human Behaviour. Welcome to the podcast, Matti.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Yeah, so I think this is quite an example of fortuitous or happy things in science. So I had been working on these questions of children's moral concern for many years. So I'd done some work looking at particularly children's attitudes towards animals and how they differed from adults. And I had work showing that children care much more about animals than adults do. And I was then chatting to somebody who was in the lab with me at Yale at the time, Julia Marshall, the co-author of my paper, and she was telling me about her work, which had been looking at children's sense of obligation towards family members, friends, and strangers. And similar to what I'd found, she found that younger children thought that we had much more obligation to strangers than older children and adults did. So we thought this was cool. These were sort of parallel kind of findings. And then we teamed up and we ran a study together looking at physical distance. So this was particularly motivated by Peter Singer's child drowning in the pond scenario. And we thought, how do children think about this? Do they think we have less obligation to somebody because that person's far away? And we found the same kind of pattern where particularly younger children thought that we had more obligation to people, even when those people were physically or socially distant to us, than older children and adults felt. And so we'd been talking about these findings and we started to think, maybe there is something here. There'd been a sort of dominant narrative in psychology and moral development for quite a while that was children kind of start off with more contracted moral circles. They start off quite self-oriented, and over time they care more about others. They're more willing to share, things like that. And so we thought these findings sort of pointed in the opposite direction. And so we talked about the paper for about 2 years before we eventually sat down and decided to bring all of our findings together and try to make this case that we thought we were seeing in our data.
Now, you mention a lab, you mentioned findings. We're talking about experimental findings here. What exactly does that look like? Because I think some listeners might have a slightly warped view of what psychological experiments look like.
In a developmental lab, typically what that will involve is several different developmental researchers who are all conducting studies. Now, more and more these studies are actually run online, but historically, sort of pre-pandemic, what would happen is families have signed up or said that they were interested in participating in research. So you reach out to them and you say, hey, I have a study where we're going to, ask your children to make moral judgments about human and animal lives. Are you interested in participating? And then they write back and say yes. And then you find a time and they come into the lab, which is basically a few different rooms with some toys, and it's very child friendly. They bring their kids in, you hang out with them for a little bit, get everybody comfortable, and then you go and run this experiment. And at the end, the kid gets a prize. And you say thank you to the family, you explain the research. Now, more and more that's done online, so you do the same thing, but rather than them coming into the lab, you do the experiment on Zoom or another kind of video platform. And most of the studies that I ended up running, because the pandemic hit right in the middle of my postdoc, were like this, but we did have a few that we ran completely in person as well. And so that is a lab in developmental psychology.
And what sort of age group of children are we talking about here? Presumably not toddlers.
No, so I tend to work with children from sort of 4 or 5 years up to about 10 years of age because, as you know, toddlers are much more difficult to work with. They can't really talk to you. They can't talk to you about their moral thoughts very easily. And I've also tried to do a little bit of work with teenagers, but they're extremely difficult to find. They don't often hang out with their parents, so they're more difficult to recruit. And even when you do get them into the lab or into experiments, they don't tend to be as excited, and they don't like our stickers and our toothbrushes as prizes. So they're harder to please. So kind of that 4 to 10 years is really a sweet spot in terms of, engagement with family, willingness to come in, good studies, and also I think you can answer really, really interesting questions across this sort of middle childhood period.
So let's start looking at some of these questions. You've already mentioned these different senses in which someone can be distant from someone else. And so let's work through those. Let's start with what you call relationally close versus relationally distant individuals. So what does that mean exactly? And then how do children and adults compare when it comes to the moral intuitions or moral judgments here?
So that work was all done by Julia Marshall. So she had experiments where she asked children about obligation to help. So she would tell children about a person or a child at a park who's either fallen down or is very hungry, so they need help in some way. And she would then tell them, there's another person around. Does this person have to help? And she varied whether that other person was a family member, a friend, or a stranger. And she just asked children about their judgments as well as adults and said, does this person have to help the hurt child? And what she finds generally is that children think that we have obligations to help people regardless of whether they're strangers or family, whereas adults think that we are less obligated or that strangers are less obligated to help. What this suggests is that younger children don't differentiate as much between friends and strangers and who we think of as being worthy of moral concern or who we have moral obligations towards.
And that's contrary to what we might expect, right? That's not what a lot of the literature is suggesting or has assumed would be the case.
Yeah, so for many years there's been work showing, for example, that children know from about 4 years of age that they should share equally. So if you tell them, there's a child that's going to come into the museum later who might not get any stickers, would you like to donate some of your stickers to them? Children from about 4 years of age say that yes, we should share equally, but it's not until about 8 years of age that they will actually do that with their own stickers. Similarly, older children are much more concerned about, doing the right thing, preventing people from being excluded from groups, things like that. So there's been this sort of narrative that as children get older, they become more concerned about making sure things are fair and being inclusive and being kind to others. However, there is also some other work that aligns with what Julia and I are finding. So for example, Felix Warneken finds that young children in particular are very, very willing to help. So they're quite indiscriminate in who they'll go and help. They'll help strangers, they'll help anybody, and then as you get older, they start to be a little bit more restrictive. So while there has been one narrative that kind of goes against what we said, there is also literature out there that aligns with what we're finding. So there's a whole bunch of really conflicting findings out there in the literature, really.
So the second kind of distance that you talk about is this idea of geographically distant others. How do children compare with adults when we look at that sort of distance?
So we see a very similar pattern to what we see with this relational closeness. So we asked children about somebody who either lives really close to them or lives really far away. So we said they could either walk to get to one another or take a plane to get to one another. And then we said, if there's these two people, if this person who's needed help, would this other person have to help them? And basically it was the same kind of judgment, but instead of varying social relationships, we varied physical distance, and we also did the same for social distance, and we see a similar pattern across both. And here what we find is that children, as compared to adults, think that we are similarly obligated to help somebody who is physically distant from us and physically close to us, whereas adults think we have much less obligation to help somebody that they're physically far away. We did also try to control for things like ease of helping. So we said, you can choose to help someone that's far away, for example, by donating money to them. But of course, it's possible that this kind of physical distance and difficulty factor played into the results a little bit there.
And then it's the third kind of distance that seems most obviously relevant to questions about human-animal relationships. And that's what you call phylogenetic closeness. So could you explain what you mean by phylogenetic closeness? And then the same question, how do adults and children compare when it comes to this kind of distance?
Yeah, so when we talk about phylogenetic closeness, we're talking really about evolutionary distance. So animals that are closer to us. There's been work with adults, for example, that shows that we have more empathy and more moral concern for beings that are evolutionarily closer to us along that sort of, phylogenetic history. We were really interested in understanding whether these kinds of judgments applied to children as well, or how children thought about these judgments. So Lucius Caviola, who was the co-lead on that paper with me, had already done work with adults looking at how they trade off human and animal lives. And he found very reliably that we prioritize human life much more than animal life, so to very large numbers of animals. He also found, for example, that we're more willing to make utilitarian judgments about animal lives, so it's more acceptable to sacrifice one pig to save 5 pigs than it would be to sacrifice one person to save 5 people. So we were interested in understanding where children fall on this sort of human-animal trade-off spectrum. So we brought children into the lab or online, as we discussed before, and we gave them dilemmas, and we told them, so there are 2 boats, both of these boats are sinking. You can choose to save just one. Now on one boat, there's one person, and on the other boat, there's, for example, 1 dog, or maybe we said 2 dogs, 10 dogs, 100 dogs. We also did the same for pigs, and we had increasing numbers of people as well. So basically all possible combination of people versus dogs and people versus pigs. And what we find here is that adults prioritize one person over even 100 dogs or pigs. So that was the largest number that we tested. They're pretty much always choosing the person. By contrast, children would choose, I think on average, 2 dogs or 10 pigs over one person. So the variability was just huge. It wasn't that children didn't prioritize humans over animals at all. It was just that they did that to much less of a degree than adults did. So again, this seems to match what we're seeing with the physical distance and the social distance, that children are putting animals much closer to the center of their moral circle than adults are. And so we kind of see this pattern across all these 3 kinds of distance.
And it is striking that it's the dogs who are being weighted higher than the pigs in these experiments.
Yes.
And so presumably this comes back to the social distance element. This is different kinds of distance interacting.
Yes, so I think you're completely right there. We tend to have much more exposure to dogs, and we did also find in the original study that children and adults who regularly interacted with animals, or particularly with dogs, tended to grant more moral consideration both to dogs and to pigs. So definitely exposure to dogs was a predictor, but also I think, dogs are animals that we interact with all the time. We seem to care a lot about them, whereas pigs are animals that we don't interact with as much socially. We do also see as food for many people, and so I think that was reflected there. So we see that for both children and adults, they prioritize humans over pigs more than they prioritize humans over dogs.
I know this wasn't your study, but I was really quite intrigued to see the study you mentioned from Karen Husson and Paul Harris, which showed that children sometimes judge violence against animals as worse than violence against other children.
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating. So this was a study all the way back in 2010, and they sort of asked children about all these different kinds of harm, and they found that in general, children thought it was just as bad, or in many cases worse, to harm animals than it was to harm other people. And they had sort of some open questions there, why that is, and a lot of children referred to the fact that these animals are quite vulnerable. And so it seems like vulnerability is something that children are particularly attuned to in these judgments.
Why is it that children are more open to moral duties towards distant others than are adults?
I don't think I can give you a definite answer yet. We need to do many more years of research. And I think the way I think about this question is what changes between 10, which is sort of the oldest children we're testing, where they're saying, yes, I care about animals, I care about distant people, I care about strangers. And then you jump to sort of 18, 20-year-olds where you're doing surveys with the general public, and we're seeing this kind of pattern of thinking that socially, physically, phylogenetically close beings are so much more important. And there's just so much that happens through that period that it is going to be very difficult to give a single answer. But we speculate on a few things in the paper. So one idea is that, when children start out learning about how to interact with others, we teach them very straightforward, simple rules. We say you should be kind to others, you should care about others, you should treat others fairly, things like that. And it's much easier to learn a simple rule like that than to then, and over time, to then start saying, okay, but under these conditions or under certain contexts, that might not apply. And so I think it could be something just explicitly where they're teaching them, but it could also be something they're implicitly picking up from us, right? So we might say you should be kind to everybody, but we then don't, for example, give money to a homeless person on the street, or we don't donate to a charity, or we do continue to eat meat. And once children understand that sort of animal meat link as well, that's something that they would definitely reflect on. So I think it's probably a combination of learning both explicitly and implicitly from what they're seeing in society. It might also be just that children don't yet, and I've been trying to figure out exactly what this looks like, but potentially children don't have a good idea of the costs associated with these kinds of moral claims yet. So sometimes when we say that some of the criticisms that are leveraged against people who, for example, advocate for us to care about people on the other side of the world, so, Peter Singer's arguments that we have moral obligations to strangers in different countries, the argument there is that it's too costly for an individual to take this on. Obviously, some adults think that it's not, but it is obviously a very challenging moral position. And it might be that children don't yet understand the full costs associated with this, that, the financial strain, the emotional strain of caring as well, right? If you go around, I think there's a term, vistopia, sort of that feeling that vegans have about the dystopian feelings for vegans. If you care really greatly about something and you know that animals are suffering, for example, but you care a lot about them, that can be really challenging. And we know from work in the meat paradox that we are motivated to deny mind and moral standing to animals when we are confronted with the realities of eating them. And so potentially it's protective to move away from caring as well. So it can be practical costs, both in terms of, money, but also like emotional costs and what it actually means for us to care about these things when there is suffering happening. So they're just some ideas of what might be changing for children.
So in that answer to the question, you raise this tricky puzzle about the relationship between moral judgments and our actions. Do you worry that a focus on moral judgments might be less important than a focus on moral behaviour? So it might be all well and good that people judge that we should help distant others, including animals, but if they don't actually do anything about that, it might not be that important.
I have spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think I've come to the conclusion that it's important to understand our moral sentiments, even if they don't necessarily predict behaviour, or even if it's not necessarily related to our behaviour. So in part, I think that asking people to change their behaviour is a lot more complicated than asking people to change their moral sentiments. So I, for example, might really care about climate change, right? But the cost of solar panels is very expensive, so I'm not going to go and buy them, even though I know I should. Or, take an example closer to home. I do really care about climate change, but I also fly home once a year to see my family in Australia because they're really important to me. I care about both of these things. And so I don't think it's fair to hold the moral standard as being, well, if you don't act in line with this, if your behaviour doesn't match it, then you obviously don't care about this. I think we can genuinely care about something without necessarily acting in accordance with it. And I think it's still important to understand these sentiments because they do give us a sense of, what people's beliefs and attitudes are out there. And these things are often precursors to behavior, and it often can give insight into the things that underpin people's beliefs and attitudes, which I think are important for us to know about. On the flip side, I think that I'm probably going to regret bringing this up because I'm digging myself into a corner here, but we haven't even really done a good job of defining what we mean by moral concern. So you say, does it matter if the beliefs are one thing and the actions are another thing? But right, there's many different things that we could be talking about when we're thinking about moral concern, and we haven't necessarily teased these things apart particularly well either. And so as an example that we raise in the paper, I think it was in 1912 that the Titanic sank, and women and children were put on lifeboats as, primarily they were prioritized in getting them off the ship. But at the same time, women didn't have the right to vote in the United States at the time, and children were, often subject to very lax labor laws. And so understanding what we mean by different kinds of moral concern, and both how this plays out behaviorally, but also how these things can conflict, is really important. And so, yes, I think it does matter to a degree if it doesn't predict behavior. Obviously, if you say one thing and do something completely different, that's not good. But I don't think that we should expect perfect matches between people's intentions or attitudes and their behavior all the time.
This is potentially a related question and links back to that initial question I asked about what does a psychology experiment look like. Is there a risk that the findings from these controlled experimental approaches about moral judgment or moral attitudes don't actually match with their real worldviews?
Yes, I think that's possible. So in these contexts that we're asking these questions, there's a person sitting there asking, so children often, may feel some kind of pressure to give certain kinds of answers, but also there's just a lot less information out there. So as an example, we might be giving children information about, there's people on this boat and dogs on this boat, which boat do you want to save? And that's the only information that they have. But out in the real world, it could be, if there were actually two sinking boats, that one of the boats was a different color, or one of the boats was closer to you, or one of the boats, there's a whole range of factors out there that could have had an impact on your willingness to pick. You'd also probably have more information about who is actually on these kinds of boats and things like that. And so we're certainly potentially not capturing all of the relevant information that goes into these judgments. Understanding what that relevant information is a really big task, and I think it's still really important to get this kind of baseline set of information. There's a really good paper actually called The Moral Psychology of Raceless, Genderless Strangers. I think it's about 10 or so years old now. And that paper kind of makes the same case that moral psychology is really plagued by the fact that because what we're trying to do is get at these sort of basic principles underlying people's moral judgments, we've stripped away a bunch of contextual information that's really important. And I think we do need to understand that contextual information, but you also have trade-offs with, how many studies would you need to run to look at all the contextual factors, and how important is that? Is that a good use of research funding? So you get into this very big, complicated question. And I think still trying to understand, at its core, what kinds of judgments do we make is important, even if it's not the only question we should be asking.
So let's pull back a little bit from these findings and these particular experiments and say, well, if we've got a different idea about children's moral judgments and the development of children and how that relates to their changing views of animals in particular I'm interested in, what could we take away from that for animal activism? Have we got a way in with children that we didn't think we had?
Yeah, so this is also very challenging. I feel like you're asking me all the really big questions today, which is lovely. The most obvious or easy response to this is, yes, we know children care more about animals, so of course we should talk to them and try to get them to not stop caring about animals through their teenage years and into adulthood. And that's possibly true, but it comes with a few risks. One risk, of course, is we don't know what happens between sort of 10 and 18 years when children's views about animals change. So we don't know what kinds of things we would need to be protecting against. It's possible that even if we gave all this advocacy to children, whatever happens through that teenage years would still go ahead. So I think it's a possibility, but we'd need more data first to be able to make strong claims, and you'd need to test it to make a strong claim. But it certainly indicates that way. The other side of it is kind of a more practical question, which is, how do families feel about us talking to their children about this? The view that animals are morally important isn't something that's necessarily widely endorsed. Of course, very few people want animals to suffer, but many people think that humans are much more important than animals. I recently had a reviewer take very strong offense to one of my studies where we were looking at these trade-offs and sort of deliver some questions that implied, that because I thought speciesism was a problem, I must endorse racism, for example, which I thought was a really strange kind of comparison to make, but that was one interpretation. I've had, for example, parents that have asked me to pull their children out of the studies. It doesn't happen often, but it has happened because they're not comfortable with the answers. And often I have to say to parents who are shocked, hey, this is exactly what all children around that age say, because the responses are just so different than what adults think is the morally right answer in many cases. And actually, I was subject to this myself. So when we first started running these studies, we have control questions in there. So would you save one person or 10 worms, one person or 10 plates? And we took those as sort of, if they said yes to the plates or the worms, then that would imply that they didn't really understand the task. And so we would exclude them and we get the same results, whether they're in the data or not. But some children did take the plates and the worms. And I was asking children in the pilot, why did you pick those answers? And one girl said, well, I picked worms because worms help the earth and humans hurt the earth. And I was like, wow, that is a coherent moral view. It might not be one that everybody agrees with, but she's thought this through. And I'm saying, oh, well, your moral answer is wrong, when really that was just my own judgments about what's morally right here. And so jumping all the way back to your actual question, I think that it is a real challenge of understanding how to talk to children and talk to families about this, because it's not something that everybody is going to be open to. But again, not a reason not to do it, just something that we would need to really think about.
This child with the worms is brilliant. It's fascinating. And it hit home something that I really enjoyed in the paper, was the fact that these experiments aren't just finding that children have this view and this view. They're also finding that they actually have good reasons for these views a lot of the time. These are reasoned views, not just knee-jerk reactions.
Yes, so in some of our studies, I don't think we've ever asked reasoning outside of the piloting for the animal trade-offs, but we have in the distance trade-off. And a lot of the time, children, particularly younger children who are more likely to say that we have to help, will say, but the person needs help, the person is really hurt. And so they are understanding the moral gravity of the situation, and they are making what seems to be a moral judgment. Whereas older children who say, no, we don't have to help, distant people, are often saying, well, we're not obligated to help anybody. And so it's not necessarily a problem with distance, but they're just saying we don't really have obligations to anybody at all. But yes, it does seem, though, that children have, when you talk to them anecdotally and in the context that we have asked about their reasoning, it does seem that they are really making moral judgments here. They're not just sort of picking at random or saying, oh, I like this animal, things like that. Actually, another study that I was involved with, led by Karri Neldner, which was a study on the moral circle in children. So we adapted the moral expansiveness scale for children. And then that was in 2018. And then in 2023, we published a paper where we compared children's responses for how much they care about different entities, which is what we used as a measure of moral concern, to how much they like entities and what they know about different entities. And we show that children do differentiate between different entities along these three dimensions. So they are really differentiating these concepts. It's not that they're just saying, oh, I like this entity, so that means I grant it moral concern. One other thing that I note, and anytime I have a research assistant that I've been working with for a while and we have this conversation, we all come up on the same thing. When you're talking to kids and you're running these experiments, you can just kind of tell if a child gets it, right? You can see some of them get it and some of them don't. And that's not something that you can use as a justification for excluding or including them in a paper, because you need to have control questions. You need to have measures in place to make sure that they're understanding. But really, you can see when a child understands it and when they don't. And by and large, children, from 5 years and up do understand these questions and do really engage with them morally. They'll say things like, oh, this is really hard, or oh, I think it's really important that we help everybody, and things like that. So they're showing reflection in a way that suggests that they do understand these questions. But again, not something that you can use as justification in a study.
I am pleased to hear this. I mean, I know we come from different disciplinary perspectives, but there's been a big movement. In fact, I was involved in this when I was a child, of philosophy for children. And I think that often children can think about these things quite clearly in a way that adults just can't. And I'm inclined to think that often the children are better thinkers about these things than are adults because, well, I'll leave it to you to tell me why, but it does seem that they can approach these problems without certain kinds of prejudices which arrive at some point. So reading your paper was a real kind of eye-opener for me in that it kind of said something I already felt I knew, but had scientific justification for that.
That's really nice to hear. Do you have any examples? I'd love to hear about what children are good at thinking about.
Well, in philosophy for children, for example, often what will happen is children will be read a picture book with kind of philosophical themes, and they will think very, very deeply about it, whereas adults will be quick to just dismiss the picture book as a children's story. But also, they are prepared to ask questions that adults don't find interesting. That's what interests me as a philosopher. A lot of the philosophical questions that I find interesting, standard philosophy questions that we'd have in a philosophy seminar or a philosophy lecture, a lot of people need to be trained to open their mind to them. Whereas kids just get it. Kids get why we're having these conversations. Kids get why it's interesting. They don't have to be told, oh, well, this relates to this particular practical problem in the real world, or this relates to policy in such and such a way, or this relates to our activities that we undertake in our day-to-day lives. Instead, they just are interested in the question of whether animals have minds, what kinds of things animals think about, what kinds of things animals feel, for example. Whereas I think a lot of adults, they'd say, well, who cares?
Yeah, no, that's very cool. It actually occurred to me while you were saying that. So in a study that we're currently writing up, we asked children to make these moral trade-offs between human and dog lives. And then we also asked them what they think other children would say and what they think adults would say. And I think they were slightly off with predicting other children's responses, but generally they were pretty accurate at saying, they expected that adults would prioritize humans over animals more than they thought other children would. So it's not that children are out there like just assuming that everybody else thinks the same way as them, right? They're aware that there are these different views out there, but they still have the view that they hold, which I thought was a really cool finding. So I'm excited for that to be out when we publish the paper.
Oh, that's wonderful. So it sounds like there is potentially a lot more work waiting to happen on this topic about children's concern for animals.
Yes, I mean, I've been involved in some of it, but there's just so many people out there doing this work now. So there's the Karen Hussar paper that you were talking about, Luke Maguire and Jared Piazza are doing great work. So there's just, particularly in the UK, which is really nice because I wasn't sure when I left America about, moral psychology in the UK. A lot of moral psychology is in the US, but there's just this wonderful group of people out here who are working on questions about human-animal interactions and moral concern for animals. So I've been so lucky and happy to be here and get involved with all of that.
Now, Matti, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I think I am, yeah.
And feel free to interpret these questions how you like. That's part of it, I think. So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes. I should check if you think this counts, but you said interpret as I like. So I think I was about 15 or 16 and I was staying with my aunt and she gave me The Ethics of What We Eat by Jim Mason and Peter Singer, and I remember just devouring this book, and I was just so compelled by it. And so I think that would have to count as my first ever pro-animal scholarship that I read.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, so during my PhD, I guess actually, quick background, before my PhD, I learned about cultured meat, or cultivated meat as it's mostly called now, and I thought, I'm a family vegetarian, so I was raised as a vegetarian and I'd spent my whole life concerned about factory farming. And I sort of remember being about, similar age maybe to when I read The Ethics of What We Eat and thinking, I'm never going to get people to stop eating animals. Like, this just isn't going to happen. And cultured meat to me seemed like the first real opportunity that we had to actually get people to continue to eat what they want, but without causing suffering. And I was so excited about it. I spent all of these years going around and asking people, would you eat cultured meat and all of this? And then eventually I started my PhD and was like, oh, I'm a scientist. I could do research on this. And so I don't think there was any psychological research out there at the time, but I went and surveyed people about their attitudes to cultured meat and published it in 2017. So I think that counts.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I mean, Peter Singer has had just such an impact on my thinking, not only about, animals and food, but also about, our obligations to others, just in so many elements of my thinking about morality. So he's the obvious answer. And as I said earlier, there's just so many scholars that are working on these really interesting questions about the psychology of human-animal relations. So some of the work that had a really big impact on me was Steve Lochner and Brock Bastian's work on the meat paradox. So this idea that, thinking or that we're going to eat meat or eating meat can actually drive us to deny mind and moral standing to animals. I remember learning about that work and just thinking this was incredibly fascinating, and that had a big impact on where I wanted to take my own career and my own thinking.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
This is a really hard one. So I think there's quite a few things we can do, but the biggest thing to me is just talking about these topics, getting other people to think about these topics, new students that are coming in who might not have seen that this is something you can study or do professionally. Kind of legitimizing these topics feels really important. At the same time, we have to remember to not just do this in an academic silo, so we need to talk to the general public. We need to share our research with animal advocates and people that it might be able to help as well. But I think probably the biggest thing would be trying to create that social norm change around what is a legitimate topic. And I think we've seen that, I would imagine 10 years ago or so, when I started being interested in these topics, it wasn't something that was spoken about as much, and more we are seeing there's, groups and societies working on this, and it's becoming much bigger, at least in the psychology space.
Well, I think psychology is a wonderful example of this, from kind of nothing, as you say, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, let's say, to a small amount kind of 15 years ago, and now these huge conferences being put on the psychology of human-animal intergroup relations. You've completely leapfrogged us in philosophy, in the sense that we were talking about this decades ago, but in terms of the numbers, you seem to be way ahead of us now.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And yeah, the FAIR conference that we had recently was so wonderful to get to talk to so many people who are passionate about the same things as me. So I had a really wonderful time.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
So I think the instinctive answer I want to give is something really a bit of a cop-out answer, like make people care more about animals. But I guess from a practical perspective, I was thinking about it would be nice if we were able to communicate better with animals, because not only would that allow us to understand their needs better, but also it would allow them to advocate for themselves and to have a voice in this discussion. And I think the fact that they don't have one has been a really big disadvantage from an advocacy perspective.
What are you working on next?
The big question I've been thinking about lately is, what do we mean by moral concern? So I touched on this a little bit before when I was talking about the Titanic. I think another example is if you look at the moral circle, so the moral expansiveness scale, when we measure people's moral circles, what you see, for example, is that, villains are pretty consistently on the outside of the moral circle. And we also see that objects are on the outside of the moral circle. But those two things are there for very different reasons. A chair is on the outside of the moral circle because it's amoral, it's morally irrelevant. It wouldn't make sense unless you're a panpsychist to give moral consideration to a chair. By contrast, a villain is on the outside of the moral circle, I think, because we see them as having done something wrong and we think that they deserve to be punished and to suffer. And right now, when we think about moral concern, we aren't really differentiating between these different things, even though they're really important. I have a little bit of data in an IMPREP paper where we show that the relationships between kind of commonly used measures of moral concern in psychological research aren't particularly strong. So we're not seeing that these things are necessarily capturing the same construct. And I'm really interested in trying to understand, what kinds of factors are relevant for moral concern? So that's going to be looking at the philosophical literature. What do we mean by moral concern? But also bringing that back to what does the public think about when they're answering these questions, and trying to bring these two things together in my mind, which is, I think I'm on my 5th rewrite of the paper at the moment. So it's been a challenge, but a really fun one.
How can people find out more about your work?
So I quit Twitter, or X, last year, so I don't have that anymore, but I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on LinkedIn, and I have a website where I have access to all of my papers and things like that. And if people are interested, they're also very welcome to just email me. My email's on my website.
Well, thanks so much, Matti, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really lovely to chat. Thanks for your great questions.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and you can follow me on X. I'm on Instagram, and I'm on Blue Sky. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.